If someone had told me 10 years ago that my life would be defined by the silence of old buildings, I would have believed them. I was a creature of dust and quiet, a cataloger of things left behind. My world was flat, measured in archival paper and the precise weight of a leather-bound ledger. It was a safe world, a predictable one, a lonely one. If they had told me my life would be appended by Julian Vance, I would have laughed. Julian Vance was not a man of silence. He was a man of impact, of noise. He was the force that strode through the quiet halls of our architectural restoration firm, his heavy work boots echoing on the polished hardwood floors, a sound that always made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. He was my boss, a fact that felt as vast and uncrossable as an ocean. I existed in the firm's library, a forgotten wing filled with blueprints and forgotten histories. My official title was head archivist, a grand name for a man who spent his days talking to ghosts. Julian was the founder, the visionary, the man whose name was on the letterhead. He was built like the old city buildings he restored, solid, imposing, with a facade that gave nothing away. He was all sharp angles and rough textures. From his jawline to the calloused hands I sometimes saw resting on a set of plans. My observation of him was a secret habit, a dangerous little indulgence. From the tall windows of the archive, I could sometimes see him in the courtyard below, arguing on his phone, his voice a low rumble I couldn't hear, but could somehow feel through the thick glass. He moved with an impatient energy, a restless force that seemed barely contained by his expensive suits. He was, to my quiet and ordered mind, a beautiful kind of chaos. An earthquake I wanted to study from a safe distance. The distance was the key. It was a professional necessity. He was Mr. Vance, and I was Leo, the quiet man in the library he likely barely registered. Our interactions were brief, transactional. He would appear in my doorway, a monolith blocking the light, and ask for a file, a date, a specific blueprint. His voice was always clipped, efficient. He never used my name. It was always, I need the schematic for the old courthouse, or find me the original deed for the waterfront project. I was a function, a search engine made of flesh and anxiety. And I was fine with that, or I told myself I was. It was easier to admire a storm from behind a reinforced wall. To want something you knew you could never have was a special kind of self-torture, and I had become an expert at it. I buried my longing under stacks of paper, filed it away in manila folders labeled impossible. He was everything I was not, confident, decisive, overwhelmingly present, and, as far as the office gossip was concerned, relentlessly straight. This was the status quo, a delicate, painful balance I had curated for 3 years. I had my routine, my quiet corners, my secret observations. My life was a meticulously organized archive of unlived moments. Then came the Blackwood Manor project, and the storm. The disruption arrived, as they always do, in a plain manila envelope. A potential client, a massive one. The Blackwood estate was a forgotten Gothic masterpiece, crumbling on a remote stretch of coastline 2 hours north of the city. It was the kind of project Julian lived for, a challenge, a legacy. It was also a mess of conflicting deeds, lost blueprints, and rumored secret passages. It was a project that required his archivist. "You're with me," he'd said, not a question. He stood in my doorway, already dressed in rugged field clothes that made him look less like a chief executive officer and more like an adventurer from an old novel. "We're doing a preliminary survey. I need your eyes on the original structure. Be ready in 30-inch. My heart did a frantic, stupid flutter, a trapped bird against my ribs. A full day with him, away from the safety of the office, in a car, in a crumbling old house. It was a fantasy and a nightmare, woven together. The drive up the coast was agonizingly silent. I sat in the passenger seat of his enormous truck, a vehicle that seemed as unnecessarily powerful as the man driving it. I focused on the landscape rushing by, the gray sea churning on our left, the dense, dark woods on our right. The air in the cab was thick with the scent of his cologne, something clean and sharp like cedar and ozone, and the silence. It was a physical weight pressing down on me. I tried to think of something to say, anything to break the tension that was coiling in my stomach like a snake. But my mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by proximity and panic. Julian seemed unaffected. He drove with one hand on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road. The tense set of his jaw was the only indication of any emotion at all. Was he angry? Annoyed at having to bring me along? I was an expert at reading the language of old paper, the subtle clues in faded ink. But this man was an undecipherable text. We arrived at the manor as the sky began to bruise. The house was a skeleton against the darkening clouds, its windows like vacant eyes. It was beautiful and tragic, a sleeping giant. We spent the next few hours working, moving through the cavernous, cold rooms. I had my notes, my flashlight, my purpose. I could focus on the task, on the elegant decay of the architecture, the ghost of what it once was. Here, I was competent. I could name the style of the cornices, date the millwork by the cut of the wood. Julian worked with a focused intensity, his large frame moving through the derelict spaces with a surprising grace. He was taking measurements, testing the structural integrity of beams, his presence a solid, reassuring thing in the growing gloom. For a few hours, we were just two professionals, working in tandem. The distance was there, but it was a functional distance, not the chasm of the office. The first fat drops of rain hit the tall, arched windows just as I was examining the brittle pages of the old house's logbook in the library. A moment later, the sky opened. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a solid wall of water that blurred the world outside into an impressionist painting of gray and green. The wind howled, rattling the window frames in their sockets. "Looks like we're not going anywhere," Julian's voice came from the doorway, making me jump. I hadn't heard him approach. My phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. We were in the middle of nowhere, and a storm that the weather service had promised for tomorrow had decided to arrive early. We were trapped. The word echoed in the vast, cold library. Trapped. Together. The sun vanished, and the world outside the windows went from twilight to pitch black in a matter of minutes. The only light came from our flashlights, their beams cutting sharp, nervous paths through the oppressive darkness. The cold, which had been a minor inconvenience, now seeped into my bones. "There's a fireplace in here," Julian said, his voice practical, grounding. "Let's see if we can find some dry wood." And just like that, the dynamic began to shift. We were no longer boss and employee. We were two people in a dark, cold house, trying to get warm. We found a stack of old, dry logs in a service closet, and, after a few tense moments, Julian managed to coax a flame to life in the massive stone hearth. The firelight changed everything. It pushed back the suffocating darkness, painting the room in flickering shades of orange and gold. It softened the hard edges of Julian's face, casting dancing shadows across his features. For the first time, I saw him not as Mr. Vance, the intimidating boss, but just as Julian, a man. We sat on the dusty floor, close to the growing warmth, the storm a wild symphony outside. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the awkward, tense silence of the truck. This was a shared silence, a small pocket of quiet carved out of the chaos of the storm. I found myself watching him again, my secret habit now playing out in plain sight. I watched the way the firelight caught the silver threads at his temples, a detail I'd never noticed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. I noticed a thin, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a faint imperfection on his otherwise imposing face. I wondered how he got it. A childhood accident? A fight? Each new detail was a revelation, a tiny piece of the man I was slowly beginning to see. He caught me staring. My breath hitched. I looked away quickly, my face burning with heat that had nothing to do with the fire. I expected a sharp word, a look of annoyance. Instead, when I risked a glance back, he was just looking at me, his expression unreadable. "You're good at what you do, Leo," he said, and the sound of my own name from his lips was so unexpected it felt like a physical touch. My head snapped up. It was the first time he'd ever used it. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," I mumbled, my voice feeling thick and clumsy. "Julian," he corrected, his gaze steady. Tonight, I think you can call me Julian. Something small and fragile inside me began to thaw. The ice that had encased my heart for years felt a tiny, painful crack. We were in a forgotten house, cut off from the world, and the carefully constructed walls between us were beginning to crumble, brick by dusty brick. We sat there for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the roar of the storm. I noticed he was shivering slightly, despite the heavy jacket he wore. He seemed weary. The relentless energy that usually surrounded him was gone, replaced by a profound exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. It was a vulnerability I had never imagined in him. The strong, silent archetype was showing its seams. "Are you cold?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. It felt audacious, too personal. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "A little. This old stone holds the chill." In the corner of the library, I had seen a pile of old, heavy draperies discarded during some long-ago renovation attempt. They were dusty but thick. On impulse, I stood up and retrieved one. It was heavy wool, smelling of dust and time. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my mind screaming at the insanity of what I was about to do. Then I stepped towards him. "Here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I unfolded the heavy fabric and draped it over his shoulders. As I did, my fingers brushed against the side of his neck. It was an accident, a fleeting, feather-light contact of my cold skin against his warm skin. But it felt like a bolt of lightning. A searing, instantaneous heat shot up my arm, exploded in my chest, and left me breathless. My entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. The rough texture of his stubble, the surprising softness of his skin beneath it, the solid muscle of his neck. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure he could hear it. I retreated back to my spot by the fire, my mind reeling. Shock, panic, and a deep, aching current of want that was so powerful it terrified me. Julian didn't move. He sat perfectly still, the heavy drapery pooled around his shoulders. He was looking into the fire, but his focus seemed to be somewhere far away. The silence stretched, now filled with a new, vibrant tension. The air between us was charged, humming with the unspoken thing that had just happened. That tiny accidental touch had changed the landscape of the room, the landscape of everything. A loud crack of thunder directly overhead made the entire house shudder. At the same moment, a steady dripping sound started from the corner of the room. A leak. Water was seeping through the ceiling, pooling on the darkwood floor. Julian was on his feet instantly, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by the familiar man of action. "Damn it," he muttered, moving towards the leak with his flashlight. But this was my territory. I had spent weeks studying the manor's original blueprints, memorizing its secrets. "Wait," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "I know what that is." He turned, surprised. "There's an old copper drain pipe that runs through the wall there," I explained, walking towards the spot. It was a design flaw in the original plans. It's probably clogged with a century's worth of leaves. The pressure from the storm must have cracked it. He shone his light on the ceiling, then back at me, a flicker of something new in his eyes. "Respect. What do we do?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it was a monumental shift. He was asking for my help, for my knowledge. The unapproachable boss was deferring to me, the quiet archivist. The power dynamic, for a moment, was completely inverted. I was the one in control. "There should be an access panel in the adjoining study," I said, my confidence growing. "We can't fix it, but we might be able to redirect the flow, save the floorboards." For the next hour, we worked together. I directed him, pointing out the hidden panel behind a bookcase, explaining the strange layout of the old pipes. He did the heavy work, prying open the panel, his strong hands effortlessly managing the rusted hinges. We were a team. The cold, the storm, the awkwardness from our touch, it all faded into the background, replaced by a shared purpose. We managed to rig a temporary solution, using an old metal wastebasket to catch the worst of the water. We were both damp and covered in dust, but we had done it. We stood side by side, looking at our handiwork, our shoulders almost touching. "I never would have found that," he said, his voice low. He turned to look at me, and we were suddenly very close. The firelight flickered across his face, and I could see the genuine appreciation in his eyes. "You really know this place." "It's my job," I said, but the words felt inadequate. "No," he said, his gaze intense. "It's more than that. You feel it, don't you? The history, the life of the building." I could only gnaw my throat tight. He saw me. He actually saw me, not just as an employee, but as someone who shared his passion. The storm continued its assault on the old house, a relentless drumming that seemed to isolate us even further from the rest of the world. With our small crisis averted, we returned to the fire, settling back onto the dusty floor. But the space between us had shrunk. We sat closer now, the shared experience a bridge across the former divide. We were wrapped in our own blankets, two islands in a sea of darkness, but we were islands in the same archipelago. The conversation started slowly, hesitantly. He asked me about my work, about how I'd come to love history. I found myself talking more than I had in years, the words spilling out of me, clumsy at first, then more confident. I told him about growing up in a small town, finding solace in the library, in the stories of people and places long gone. It was a way to connect without the risk of connection. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't look at his phone, which was useless anyway. He just listened, his eyes fixed on my face, his expression thoughtful. And then he started to talk. He spoke of the immense pressure he felt to live up to his father's name. His father had started the company from nothing, a legendary figure whose shadow Julian still lived in. He confessed that the confidence I saw, the decisive arrogance, was an armor he had built for himself, a role he played. "People expect me to be him," he said, his voice quiet, rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "They expect me to have all the answers. But most of the time, I'm just guessing." This confession was a crack in his facade, a glimpse of the man beneath the myth. The strong, silent man was lonely. The weight of his own company, his own legacy, was crushing him. "I watch you sometimes," he admitted, and my heart stopped dead in my chest. "In the library. You're so self-contained. You seem at peace in that quiet. I envy that." I wanted to laugh. Me? At peace? I was a roiling sea of anxiety and unspoken longing. But I understood what he meant. I had built a fortress of solitude, and from the outside, it looked like peace. From his fortress of leadership, he saw my prison as a sanctuary. "It's not peace," I confessed in turn, my voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "It's just quiet." He nodded, understanding. "I don't have quiet. My head is never quiet." The air grew thick with all the things we weren't saying. The accidental touch. The way our eyes kept meeting and holding for a second too long. The intimacy of the firelight and the shared confessions. It was a delicate, terrifying bubble of honesty, and I was afraid to breathe for fear of breaking it. He shifted, turning to face me more fully. The heavy drapery slipped from one of his shoulders. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes, which I had always thought were a cold, distant gray, were warm in the firelight, filled with a startling vulnerability. "Leo," he said, and the way he spoke my name was different this time. It wasn't just a word. It was a sound that held weight, that held a question. My entire body was thrumming with a nervous energy. "This is it," a small voice whispered in my mind. "This is the moment the world either breaks or rearranges itself completely." He reached out, his hand moving with an agonizing slowness, as if giving me every possible chance to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I was frozen, mesmerized. His fingers, calloused and warm, brushed a stray piece of hair from my forehead. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it shattered the last of my defenses. My breath caught in my throat. His hand lingered, his thumb stroking my temple gently. His touch was a question. My stillness was the answer. He leaned in, his gaze never leaving mine. The world shrank to the space between our faces. The roar of the storm, the crackle of the fire, it all faded into a distant hum. All that existed was the look in his eyes, a mixture of uncertainty, longing, and a profound, bone-deep loneliness that I recognized because it mirrored my own. When his lips met mine, it wasn't a collision. It was a discovery. It was slow, hesitant, achingly soft. It was not a kiss of passion, but of confession. A confession that went deeper than words. It tasted of dust and rain and the faintest hint of whiskey from a flask I now realized he must have had in his coat. It was a kiss that said, "I am as lost as you are. I'm as lonely as you are. Let's be lonely together, just for a moment." I kissed him back, a lifetime of unspoken want pouring into that simple, fragile connection. My hand came up to rest on his jaw, feeling the rough stubble under my palm. It was real. This was real. The man I had admired from an impossible distance was here, his lips against mine, his hand in my hair. The walls of my carefully constructed world were not just crumbling. They were being obliterated. The kiss ended as gently as it began. We pulled apart slowly, the space between us now humming with a potent, shimmering energy. We just looked at each other, breathing in the same charged air. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened. It was too new, too fragile. He didn't pull away completely. His hand remained on my face, his thumb stroking my cheekbone. The storm raged on outside, but inside the library, in our small circle of firelight, a profound and terrifying stillness had fallen. We had crossed a line, and I had no idea what lay on the other side. But for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I was only afraid of it ending. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful. We didn't talk again. We simply rearranged ourselves by the dwindling fire, wrapped in our separate blankets, but closer than before. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Close enough that I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing as he finally drifted off. I lay awake for hours, replaying the kiss, the touch, the look in his eyes, trying to commit every detail to memory, terrified that if I fell asleep, I would wake up and it would have all been a dream. The morning after came too soon. I woke to silence. A jarring, absolute silence. The storm had passed. The fire was nothing but gray ash and a few glowing embers, and the spot beside me was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized my chest. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sunlight, pale and watery, streamed through the tall, grimy windows of the library, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room looked different in the daylight. Larger, colder, emptier. The magic of the night had vanished with the darkness. I found him in the main hall, on his phone. A signal. The world had rushed back in. He was standing with his back to me, his voice once again the clipped, efficient tone of Mr. Vance, the boss. He was arranging for a tow truck, talking logistics, making plans. The man who had confessed his loneliness to me by the fire was gone. In his place was the impenetrable figure I knew from the office. He ended the call and turned. He saw me standing there, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Panic? Regret? Then it was gone, replaced by a cool, professional mask. "There's a truck on its way," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any of the warmth from the night before. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at a spot just over my shoulder. "Okay," I managed to say, my own voice a pathetic croak. The intimacy we had shared was a ghost in the room, a phantom limb that ached with its own absence. I felt naked, exposed. Had I imagined it all? Had the storm and the isolation created a moment of temporary insanity? A mistake. My mind screamed the word at me. It was a mistake. He regretted it. The drive back to the city was a masterclass in torment. It was worse than the silence on the way up. That had been a silence of strangers. This was the silence of people who had shared something profound and were now pretending it had never happened. The air in the truck was thick with unspoken words, with the memory of a kiss that now felt like a brand on my lips. I stared out the window, my reflection a pale, miserable ghost, and felt a familiar shame curl in my gut. I was a fool, a naive, romantic fool who had mistaken a moment of weakness for something more. When he dropped me off at the office to get my car, he still wouldn't look at me. "I'll see you Monday," he said, his eyes fixed on the steering wheel. Not Julian. Mr. Vance. The walls were back up, higher and thicker than ever before. I nodded, unable to speak, and fled from the truck as if it were on fire. The weekend was a special kind of hell. My small, quiet apartment, usually my sanctuary, felt like a prison cell. The solitude I had once cultivated as a defense now felt like a punishment. Every quiet moment was filled with the roaring of my own thoughts, a relentless cycle of self-recrimination. How could you be so stupid? He was lonely, you were there. It was a fluke, an anomaly. Forget it ever happened. But I couldn't forget. The memory of his touch, the taste of his lips, the vulnerability in his eyes. It was all seared into my brain. My body remembered even when my mind tried to deny it. The absence of him was a physical presence in my apartment. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was empty. It was the sound of being alone, and for the first time, I hated it. Monday at the office was worse. The building felt the same, the routine was the same, but I was irrevocably changed. I felt like I was walking around with my skin inside out, every nerve exposed. I half expected people to look at me and just know, to see my foolish secret written all over my face. Julian was a ghost. He didn't come to the library. An email appeared in my inbox in the morning, curt, professional, listing tasks for the week. There was a meeting scheduled for that afternoon with the whole project team. He canceled it 20 minutes before it was supposed to start, the email citing an unforeseen conflict. He was avoiding me. The realization landed like a stone in my stomach. It was true. He regretted it. He was embarrassed, and he was trying to erase the night in the manor from existence. And he was erasing me along with it. For 3 days, this pattern continued. Silence. Avoidance. The distance between my library and his corner office might as well have been 1,000 miles. The brief connection we'd shared was dead, and I was left to mourn alone, surrounded by the ghosts of other people's histories while being haunted by my own. The old, safe loneliness returned, but it was tainted now. It was a loneliness that knew what it was missing. On Wednesday night, I was sitting in my apartment, staring at a book I hadn't been able to read for 3 days when there was a knock on my door. It was late after 10. I never had visitors. My heart lurched with a wild, impossible hope that I immediately tried to crush. It couldn't be. I opened the door, and he was there. Julian, standing in the dim hallway of my apartment building, looking like he'd been through a war. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a rumpled shirt and jeans, his hair a mess, dark circles under his eyes. He looked exhausted, wrecked, and more human than I had ever seen him. He just stood there for a moment, looking at me. The carefully constructed walls of Mr. Vance were gone. This was the man from the library, the man from the storm. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. I stepped back, holding the door open, my mind a blank, buzzing hive. He walked into my small living room and stood in the center, looking out a place too large for the space. He looked at my shelves, crammed with books, at the neat stacks of papers on my desk. He was seeing my life, my quiet, ordered world. "I'm sorry," he said, turning to face me. He didn't make excuses. He didn't hedge. He just said the words. "For the last few days. For everything. I'm not good at this, Leo." I just stared at him, unable to form a coherent thought. I panicked, he continued, his gaze unwavering, raw with a vulnerability that stole my breath. What happened at the manor, it wasn't something I was prepared for. I spent my whole life building walls, and in one night, you just walked right through them. It terrified me. He took a step closer. So I did what I always do. I retreated. I put the walls back up, and it has been the most miserable 3 days of my life. My heart, which had been a dead weight in my chest, began to beat again, a slow, hopeful rhythm. "The silence," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I told you my head was never quiet. But since that night, it's been worse. Except it's not my own thoughts anymore. It's the silence. It's the not hearing from you, the not seeing you. It's loud." He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his eyes pleading. "I can't sleep. I come home to my big, empty house, and I just lie there. I can't sleep alone anymore. Not since that night. It's too quiet, too empty. The words hit me like a physical blow. I can't sleep alone anymore. It was the most honest, desperate, and beautiful thing I had ever heard. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as lost as I was. He was scared. In that moment, all my fear, all my self-recrimination, it all just washed away. I saw him not as my boss, not as an impossible dream, but as a man who was standing in my living room, offering me his broken, terrified heart. "You're not alone," I said, and my own voice was steady. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was like watching a dam break. He closed the remaining distance between us and pulled me into his arms. He didn't kiss me. He just held me, his face buried in my shoulder, his arms wrapped around me so tightly it felt like he was trying to hold himself together. I held him back, my hands splayed across the strong planes of his back, anchoring him. We just stood there, in the middle of my quiet life, holding on as if we were drowning. He didn't leave that night. He asked if he could stay, his voice muffled against my shirt. He didn't ask for my bed. He just gestured towards the lumpy, worn-out couch in my living room. He just wanted to not be alone. I gave him a blanket and a pillow, and he fell asleep almost instantly, the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who had finally found a safe harbor. I sat up for a long time, watching him, the imposing figure of Julian Vance, asleep on my couch, looking younger and more vulnerable than I ever could have imagined. The storm had passed, but the world it had created remained. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I walked into my tiny kitchen to find him there, barefoot, standing in a patch of morning sunlight, pouring 2 mugs. He looked up and gave me a small, hesitant smile. It felt more real, more intimate than our first kiss. "I figured you'd need this," he said, handing me a mug. We drank our coffee in a comfortable silence. The new normal. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. Before he left for work, insisting on going home to change first, he paused at the door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single key on a plain silver ring. He pressed it into my hand. "My house key," he said simply, "in case you ever want to make sure I'm not sleeping alone." The gesture was so much more than the key itself. It was an invitation, an act of trust. It was him taking down a wall, brick by brick, and asking me to step inside. It was a promise. The days that followed were a slow, careful navigation of this new territory. At work, we maintained a professional distance, but it was a facade now, a game we both knew we were playing. The real story was in small things. The brief, shared smiles across a meeting room. The text he'd send in the middle of the day just to ask what I was thinking about. The way he started using my name in front of other people, his voice lingering on it just a little too long. My life began to expand. My quiet, solitary world started to merge with his. I used the key. I let myself into his large, beautiful, and sterile house one evening and filled his quiet with the sound of me turning pages. He came home and found me on his sofa, reading, and the look of relief and pure, unadulterated happiness on his face was something I would never forget. My books started migrating to his shelves. My toothbrush appeared in his bathroom. His life had been one of grand gestures and loud impacts. Mine had been one of quiet details and subtle shifts. Together, we were finding a new language, a new rhythm. We started making coffee together every morning. Standing in his sun-drenched kitchen, the awkward silence was replaced by easy conversation about the day ahead, about a book I was reading, about a dream he'd had. We shared meals, not in fancy restaurants, but at his large wooden dining table, the one he confessed he'd never actually eaten at before. We filled the empty spaces in his life, and in mine, with the simple, profound act of being present. And we slept in the same bed. There was no anxiety anymore, no fear. There was just the solid, grounding weight of him next to me, his arm draped over my waist, his slow, deep breathing a lullaby against my back. The man who couldn't sleep alone had found his rest, and in doing so, he had woken me up from a long, lonely slumber. I look back now at the man I was, the quiet archivist hiding in his fortress of solitude. I had built my life around the principle of avoiding risk, of keeping my heart safely filed away. My world was ordered and predictable, a flat line stretching into a quiet future. Julian was the disruption. He was the storm I never saw coming, the one that tore down my walls and forced me out into the world. He was the plot twist in my carefully curated narrative. I thought he was a force of nature that would destroy my quiet life, but he wasn't the disaster. He was the reason my life finally began. He didn't just fill the silence. He taught me that some of the most beautiful things are born from the chaos, from the unexpected connection found in the heart of a storm. He saw the man hiding in the library, and he gave him the courage not just to be seen, but to step out into the light.